talked about. And I'd like to have your comments about the prospects of passage or not, and what happened with that.
Everybody get the question?
No.
Okay, the question was about, there's a ballot question, there's not only an election, but there's also ballot questions this fall. One of them is to repeal 40B, which is the so-called anti-SNAP zoning laws in Massachusetts. Professor Bluestone, this person knows quite a bit about this, so go ahead.
Let me tell you a little bit about it.
We have a microphone.
Can you hear me all right? 40B, I think, was passed in 1969. It was a very different era. And what 40B does is a community, local communities, have control over their own zoning, and often control over most of their own building inspections and so forth. We had a lot of communities that were doing so-called stop zoning. You can build a house here, but it has to be on a minimum of 2 acres. One or two cities, one or two communities, 3 acres.
5 acres.
5 acres. Wow. The result was
That's what we said.
you had very few communities in which you could put up anything that approached affordable housing. You got to pay for 2 acres of land to put up 1 unit of housing. Even if you put a little shed on it, it's going to cost you a mint. And you had here, in a sense, the interests of the town diametrically opposed to the interests of the county. Individual towns might want to keep their, keep people out for whatever reason. The state, of course, needs to keep people in. And so we passed a law, rather amazing. Maybe you remember it and can tell us about the history, because it sounds today like this would be absolutely impossible to pass. That says that if a developer comes to a community and wants to put up a housing, and the community denies it, and that community has fewer than 10% of its housing stock as affordable, meaning that someone in 80% of the area median income could afford a house at 80% of the median home value, that developer can bypass the local community, go to the state, make their case, and if the case rings sound, get what is known as a comprehensive permit to build that housing, even if the town doesn't want it. As a result, we've actually built tens of thousands of units of housing that wouldn't have been built before, about 25% of which is affordable, as I said. There are many local communities who hate this. They feel that the state is interfering in their local control. And this year they have a ballot referendum that would repeal 40B, and which was essentially make it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to produce any affordable housing whatsoever. I might add, there's a second law called 40R. I know this law very well because I'm proud to say that I was one of the co-authors of it. And under 40R, we actually reward communities with extra local aid if they create smart growth districts near transportation and allow developers to come in and build affordable housing. And we now have 33 communities that have done that, in part because they'd rather be under 40R than 40B. And there are approximately 10,000 to 10,500 housing units that could be built in those smart growth 40R neighborhoods. If 40B goes down, if we vote against 40B, that is, vote to repeal it, not only will we not have 40B, we will essentially not have 40R either. Because 40R, at least some of the incentive for going to 40R, is to an alternative route to 40B. So this is going to be very critical, and if in fact we are not successful in stopping the repeal, it is going to be even more difficult to get the housing we need to keep the young people here. I've been arguing with people in local communities, since I am part of the team trying to stop the repeal, that you should think about building affordable housing as an inoculation, like you take a smallpox inoculation. Because my economic evidence and statistical evidence I know is that if we continue to not attract young people, what will ultimately happen is that businesses won't come here. We've seen it before. And if businesses don't come here, we begin to see people leaving the state in larger numbers, and the value of your house is going to drop rather dramatically, right? So if what you're afraid of is that somebody's going to put in affordable housing and will affect the value of your home, which we've already proven doesn't happen in 40 communities, if you really want to guarantee that you're gonna lose value in your home over 10 or 15 years, repeal 40B. It's gonna be a major issue. The other referendum, by the way, on the ballot is equally devastating. There are two of them. The one is to roll back the state sales tax from 6.25% to what? 6.5 to 3%, which will cost $3 or $4 billion more. And of course, there's going to be a lot of screaming and yelling about that one. And those two referenda.
And it is polling very positively.
So those are the kinds of issues that we'll be facing. But the housing issue, and you'll hear much more about 40B and 40R and other housing issues, both because we will have completed the housing report card, which will be released on October 14th at the Boston Foundation, as well as the fact that we'll have Chip Case, probably foremost housing expert in the nation, speaking here, along with Elise Cherry, who probably knows more about financing housing than anybody on the planet. So that's going to be quite interesting.
I was deeply involved in the passage of 40B as a legislator.
How did you do it, Michael?
We just made the case and we, went after, I mean, quite frankly, we went after some pretty chintzy suburbs who were amending their zoning codes to make it virtually impossible to build affordable housing. Now, there has to be a positive component to this as well, folks. We had great success when I was governor in working with communities to build affordable housing. And we tried to do so in a way that was consistent with their plans. And you do discover that every community's got cops and firefighters and teachers, not to mention young people generally, who need affordable housing. So we had pretty good success. As a matter of fact, one of the few times I remember where the Housing Appeals Board overruled local zoning authorities was in the town of Cohasset, where the Archdiocesan Housing Office wanted to put 40 units of affordable housing in Cohasset, which at least in those days was a heavily Roman Catholic community, and the community opposed it, and so the Archdiocese went to the Housing Appeals Board, and we, in effect, set aside the local zoning, and that housing was built. But we didn't have a lot of those kinds of disputes, but the fight to get the bill was pretty fierce, and it was essentially us guys against these towns that wanted to keep us out. I mean, that was the kind of debate that we had. And
but other than the threat of excommunication, how did you get Catholics to support this?
we did. I mean, the town zoning prohibited it, and so they went to the Housing Appeals Board, and the Housing Appeals Board ruled for the Archdiocese and the 40 units that they wanted to build. But it was a fierce battle. The 60s was an extraordinary decade in this state, folks. It was a very contentious decade. It was a creative decade. It involved enormous kinds of reform efforts to restructure. When I first went to the legislature in 1962, the governor served for 2 years. The lieutenant governor could be of the other party, and often was running against the government from day one. Governors did not have the right, there was no cabinet system, they didn't have the right to appoint their own department heads. Can you believe that? Department heads had terms designed to succeed to exceed and overlap terms of governors. We had something called the Governor's Council. It's still around. It's a mere shadow of its former self. And they practically, if you governor, they practically had to give you permission to go to the bathroom. I mean, not a single gubernatorial appointment could be made without the approval of the Governor's Council. And it was a horrible system. It was a corrupt system. 5 of the 8 incumbent Governor's Councils went to jail. So it was a turbulent, but a period of great change and great reform, and 40B already happened to be just one aspect of it. Very exciting to be there.
In the back there.
Ruth?
Ruth Riles, and I've been in this class almost from the beginning.
And what do you do, Ruth?
2 hats. I do international consulting, payroll, taxes, that sort of thing. And I also have a manufacturing company with my husband. I was just thinking that a couple of the ideas that I would think would be very popular in getting more young people into the state, staying here, would be some form of working off tuition, loan payments, tuition forgiveness, if you will. And going way back to the way my husband and I went through school, when employers, or maybe in this case even partly the state, helps people get advanced degrees.
The observation for those of you here in front was one way to attract and retain young people, is the observation we have professors commented, is to offer perhaps tuition benefits to students who stay here, or some other kinds of incentives for
Loan forgiveness.
or loan forgiveness for people who actually stay here. And, it's sort of reflected in some respects on Vista volunteers or others people who do certain kinds of jobs and get certain kinds of benefits. So the observation was in part of how you attract and keep young people, so sort of additional incentives. Want to comment on that?
Well, I think, we've tried plans like that I remember there were years where with national loans from the federal government, if you went into teaching or social work, you had part of your loan forgiven. I think it's a pretty good idea. I actually have an alternative idea for how we finance higher education, public higher education, actually any higher education, is to provide loans for students which are then paid back on the basis of income contingency. That is, you pay it back as a percentage of your income as opposed to a flat payment. Because, young people trying to pay back their loans when they start their careers, particularly if they do it in a period of recession, go into bankruptcy. That's nuts. What we should do is have it that, you pay it back as your income rises. And that also means that students who go out and become very successful financially are going to pay back more than those students who go into something that may not be as financially rewarding, but is rewarding to the community in other ways. And we could do that, and there have been attempts to do it. Yale tried a program like that. It's a little complicated, but I think it's worth thinking about again, particularly given the high cost of both public and private education today. I was in a meeting the other day, and I was talking about how crazy tuitions have become, in part because I'm sending an 18-year-old son off to another private school next Monday and trying to figure out how I'm going to fund it. I thought about my own college education, and I was very fortunate to grow up in the richest city, as some of you know, Ruth knows, in the country in the 1950s, Detroit, Michigan, which also has a very, very good higher education system, including Wayne State in Detroit and Michigan State, and of course, University of Michigan, where I went. And I worked in a Ford plant every summer, for 3 summers, to find ways of getting enough income to pay for my schooling. And in one day in 1964, when the auto industry was absolutely booming, it happened to be Sunday, July 4th, I was told I had to come to work and work 10 hours. Sunday, July 4th. We were building alternators and carburetors for Ford Mustangs that had just come out. In that one day, in that one shift of 10 hours, I made enough money after taxes to pay my fall tuition. $128. In one day. I mean, I still don't make that much today. But it is the kind of thing we should be thinking about. And what I think is terrific about this open classroom and questions like that is that we should be generating all kinds of ideas about how we do things better in this state. We were talking about something that there are a number of people here from the Office of Administration and Finance. The former Secretary, Leslie Kerwin, of course, will be with us next week. And one of the things she picked up from a presentation I gave before the Joint Taxation Committee was that we take capital gains income. We get a lot of capital gains income in the state, because there are a lot of rich people in the state who make capital gains. And we make a lot of money on capital gains when the economy is really hot. And we make very little when the economy is in recession. And the result is, if you spend all that money and then you have lots of bills to pay and you don't have the money anymore, it doesn't make sense. And so we've adopted something in the state where we're going to be putting aside, at least this is, we hope to do, putting aside half or more of capital gains income and treating it not as regular income, is this correct? In such a way that, in fact, we can kind of save that, add it to the rainy day fund, build up the rainy day fund much larger than we want. Well, those kinds of ideas should be percolating out of this class. I am hoping by the end of this class on December 8th, we'll have at least 10 good ideas to give to the governor. order, Jerry, if you could.
I'm Jerry Burrow, I'm an attorney. My question is, Barry, as you showed on the demographics, and we have baby boomers getting near retirement age. And I know in this state with the pension system that we have, I understand that with the MBTA, you work 20 years, so you can retire. So you've got people in their 40s and 50s who are on full pension. And of course, when people live in, of course, the system came in when life expectancy was a lot shorter than it is today. And I want to know, I know there's been some reform on pensions, but it seems to me that there's going to be tremendous pension liabilities coming up, both in federal and state governments, and I just wonder what your thought about what can be done to solve this problem. I mean, like Dukakis, I know you're in your mid-70s or a little more than that. My wife feels terrific, but my wife went to the same school, and you're still working. I don't know how much, whether it's full-time or not, but there's no reason why people can't continue to work after they
Not only that, I'm Greek, so there's a kind of cultural thing here. The part of Greece. Did you all hear that? What do we do about this pension system?
Right.
And that's going to be part of the discussion as well. But the Greeks have about 465 certified occupations where you can retire at 50. The French transit workers are striking because they want to move from 60 to 62. And over Memorial Day weekend, Kitty and I went to Greece and came back. It's kind of crazy, but it involved a very special series of ceremonies that we've been deeply involved in an effort to memorialize victims of the Holocaust in Thessaloniki, which had one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, some 65,000 there since the Inquisition. And when I got there, as it always happens when we go to Greece, the Greek press showed up. And they said to me, now, what is the Greek American community going to do to help Greece in its hour of need? And I said, look, for one thing, we got a lot of the same problems you got in the United States right now. Because we did some rather foolish things, in my judgment, in the previous 8 years. But I said, we can't collect your taxes for you. Tax evasion is a national sport. You can't reform your bureaucracy. There are 500 employees for everyone they need in Greece. And I said, we don't retire at 50 in the United States. In fact, we don't understand a 50-year-old retirement. So, what's it going to take? A, it's going to take funding, especially in times of surplus. Very, very important, folks. I was the first governor in the history of this state to propose and get legislation to begin funding the pension system. We had never funded it, Jerry. It was all pay as you go. And so we've got to fund it, and secondly, we've got to say to folks, look, as we live longer, the retirement age can't be 50, or it can't be 20 years, or it can't be 23. Now, the T has already changed. I mean, that for employees coming in, it's no longer 20 years and up, but you can't afford that kind of financial burden if you're serious about doing the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of early retirement anyway. I mean, what do you do? Spend all day trying to figure out where you're going to have dinner at night or something. I don't know. So, but that's, and look, this requires a lot of work, effort. You've got to bring the public employee unions into it. You got to help them understand that if they want additional compensation, you can't do all this other stuff as well. I mean, this is part of the job of political leadership. But we got to fund that thing, and we have to make our pension systems less generous, not so much in terms of the level of benefits, but the time they begin to kick in and people can start collecting. And that's just reality.
Politically, can't be done.
Yeah, you can do it, but you've got to be a consensus builder. You got to bring people into the process. It's the kind of thing I try to teach around. It took me about 20 years, Jerry, to learn. I got scars all over my back in learning those lessons. But people people aren't stupid, really. The organization, but they do want to be involved. And so that's part of the process of making progress and dealing with these kinds of issues. But yeah, and look at the test of political leadership. And
Let me, if I could, add just one quick comment and then suggest something. My quick comment is, isn't it interesting that public employees, of which one is my dear wife, who's at UMass Boston, and I was a public employee for 11 years there, isn't part of the national social security system. I mean, that's nuts, right? And that's a legacy of something we were allowed to do in 1935, and we never changed it, which is crazy. The second thing is there's a lot of things that you can do to try and put together a new pension system that certainly, if it doesn't do massive harm to existing pensioners, or people who've been in, let's say, for at least 10 years, because we kind of made a promise to them, we need to put in for new people who join state government. But the third and most important is, next week, you have here Leslie Kerwin, former Secretary of A&F, who had to worry about this every day. You've got Mike Widmer, who has written about this extensively. And the following week, you have Mike Ross, the president of the Boston City Council, who has to worry about this in terms of a budget for the city of Boston, and Richard Stutman, the head of one of those powerful public employee unions in the state, that of the Boston Teachers Union. Ask them this, and particularly, you know, Mike has some very interesting things, and I would love to hear Mr. Stutzman talk about pension reform. Right? But let's do that. That's what this class is all about.
And that's the kind of dialogue that has to take place in government as well. I mean, you can't do this stuff by just dropping it. You've got to genuinely involve them, and you've got to assume, as I think you can, at least based on my experience, that people are reasonable. But they want to be genuinely involved in the solution, whether it's the cost of health care or the cost of pensions or whatever.
Let me just add that he can say that people are reasonable. He lives in Brookline. I live in Cambridge.
There are some exceptions.
I live in Boston. We're very reasonable. I think we have time for one more question. Sir.
I live in Boston. I'm a graduate of Northeast
And you are?
Science.
And you are?
Michael Lumpus. And I work for a large corporation in the city. And my question is about outsourcing and actually offshoring, because we don't use the word outsourcing. The people that we have in other countries are actually employees of our company. So I can hire as many people as I want as long as they're in those other countries. What's a reasonable public policy to address this offshoring and outsourcing?
This is a big question. The question is, what's the reasonable way of addressing the question of outsourcing or offshoring in terms of hiring new workers, you know, the distance between hiring workers who are here versus workers who are in other countries. And it obviously feeds into the whole area of employment, but also tax generation, all kinds of other things.
Mike, any thoughts? I think you've raised one of the toughest questions that we have. You know, I come out of Detroit, I come out of the auto industry, was a UAW member. Outsourcing had quite an impact on our industry, and it's undermined the entire state of Michigan, and pretty much destroyed the city of Detroit. I don't have a good answer to your question. I even wrote a whole book about it called The Deindustrialization of America in 1982. I do think that part of it is that when we make it possible for firms to go abroad, we should at least have trade laws that assure us that different countries are playing according to some of the same rules. So, for example, there are countries which have very lax environmental standards. It's cheap to run to them. There are countries that have no labor standards whatsoever. There are countries that have no child labor laws. There are countries that have no minimum wage laws. What I think we have to argue for internationally, I would think through the UN or some body like that, is to begin to harmonize at least some social protections so that we're playing on something of a level playing field. If we cannot get international bodies to do it, we should be doing that by writing it into our trade laws. In 1995, I was invited by the then majority leader of the House of Representatives in Washington, Dick Gephardt, to join his staff as a special policy advisor while I was on sabbatical from the university. And I was in charge of kind of special policies. And I had a wonderful group called the Skunk Works, which met. He became the minority leader the day I arrived. Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House. We met every Thursday morning. I brought together about 25 economists and really some wonderful journalists like E.J. Dionne, who you may once in a while hear from the Washington Post on NPR. And we met
of Fall River, Massachusetts.
Yeah, and we met every Thursday morning in the basement of the Capitol building, the one with the dome, right below the Speaker's office. And we thought about these issues. And one that we pioneered in, but of course this was not possible to do with the Republican Congress, was that we should try and move away from the kind of things we had in our trade policy at the time. To say, instead of having trade policies where we have a timetable that says over 10, 12, 14, 16 years, we will eliminate all tariffs. That instead, we would make that reduction in tariffs conditional on other countries doing certain things. And one of them that I have suggested, and we actually have the data to do it, is to say that to the extent that other countries encourage or insist that their companies improve wages along with the improvement in productivity, which is basic to standard labor economics, we will move faster toward trade liberalization with those countries. So for example, if you get a country which, because let's say a company I know well, I used to work for it, Ford builds its most modern factory in Mexico, but continues to pay very low wages despite the fact that it's getting enormous productivity gains. You should have wages rising with the improvement in productivity. And you could actually even shorten the period of time toward trade liberalization on the basis of countries deciding that it is in their interest to encourage or cajole their firms to do those kinds of things. I don't think there's much that an individual company can do, particularly if it's an incredibly competitive business and must worry about what their competitors are going to do in terms of their costs. But I think it's the kind of thing we have to insist on in terms of trade policy as we continue to develop trade policy.
I'd add just two quick things. First, just to follow up on what Barry said. I condition membership in the World Trade Organization on this kind of policy framework. Now, what kinds of minimum labor standards, what kinds of minimum environmental standards you require a member of the WTO is open to debate. But I want to see the United States pushing this. And this administration is doing it a lot more than the previous administration. But I think this ought to be part of our policy. Secondly, we have tax policies which favor companies that invest overseas. And one of the things the president's trying to do is to end this stuff. I don't understand that at all. I don't know why we got to give tax breaks to companies that are investing overseas. This doesn't make any sense. So I hope those legal loopholes can be closed as well.
You know, I looked into this, Michael, and those tax laws actually go back to the end of World War II. And they were because the United States, now in a Cold War, wanted American companies to help invest in other countries, matching funds with the Marshall Plan, which was our public plan. As far as I can tell, though, Cold War is over.
And we're losing bids, by the way.
And let me just wrap up by saying, this last question was really emblematic of a problem that we will address next week, and that is state governments and governors in particular are working within environments over which, as it was said earlier, they have little direct control. And so I think, first of all, I'd like to thank our guests tonight, Barry and Mike, for the tremendous comments. And the next week, we'll come back and talk about the fiscal picture facing Massachusetts. So we'll end it tonight. We'll see you next week. Thanks.